Hey everyone, welcome to your first lecture in sociology. Today we're going to talk about some introductory terms and some of the people that you should know about are major theorists. Like any good course, we're going to start with a definition. So what is sociology? The purest definition is that it's the scientific study of social structures. But a more kind of common way of looking at it, it's a study of a society. What does that mean? Well, that means culture, that means social patterns, that means stereotypes, that means breakdown of responsibilities. It's looking at who we are now, how did we get to this point, and what is it about us that makes us tick. The fun thing about this course is that we get to look at our culture, our society, and see how it differs within itself and from other societies. Many of you are taking this course and maybe you thought you knew what sociology was, but maybe you also confused it with psychology or anthropology or maybe even philosophy. When we start looking at the other ologies or the other science-based social sciences, there are some very distinct differences. In psychology, we look at the human mind and we look at how it impacts our behavior and our mental processes. Psychology has a single person focus. Sociology always looks at the group. Anthropology is going to go back into the study of ancient civilizations and what we can learn from their artifacts. And again, sociology is a picture of what's going on here and now. As I just said, we are going to look at human societies and social structures in a group focus. As we start having discussions and you guys start feeling a little more comfortable with interacting, you're going to realize that you have a lot of very important personal stories that you feel like kind of help explain your understanding of your society. And those are incredibly valuable. But it is very important to understand that sociology is a research-based science that looks at the group focus. So while your individual story may be 100% true for you, it may not be true for the entire society. So we look at things like social structures, patterns way in which people interact in social relationships, literally how our society has set up our interactions. So really quick, think about this. Were you raised or did you grow up in a home with two working parents, with one working parent? Was that working parent your dad or was it your mom? Maybe you didn't grow up with either of your parents and you grew up in a different family setup. That's all very, very possible. But if we're talking about American society and we want to talk about the normal social structure of it, well, today, at least from the 2010 census, it's more common to have both parents working. If we look at what's happened with the virtual learning platforms and the stressors that maybe a lot of your parents felt, especially if you have younger siblings, it came down to the fact that both of them probably felt they had to work. Then we go back and we look at, all right, well, if both of them aren't working and you have a stay-at-home parent, well, in most cases, that stay-at-home parent was probably the mom. 28% in 2010, the husband was the only one working. So still that kind of traditional idea of the primary breadwinner. 4% had the wife being the only one working, and then there's 2% where neither parent was working. We cannot sit there and say that that 4% or 2% is representative of the whole. But if that's your lived experience, it still has value when we talk about how our society operates. It's just that your perspective is going to be unique and different, where you could probably guess the majority of your peers, and maybe this does include you, had both working parents, and so you see the world through the eyes of the dominant group. We all know that our society has changed and will continue to change. We'll use different perspectives, different ways of looking at societal patterns and group behavior to understand how we were and to kind of move forward and maybe even somewhat try to predict where we're at now and how that may change in the future. Peter Berger makes a very, very important statement, and he is a notable person in this field, that using a sociological perspective helps us realize that society guides our thoughts and our deeds. It allows us to see the general in the particular. It allows us to see what everyone's doing, even in the most specific of circumstances. If we were in class face-to-face, person-to-person, I would ask you guys, who has traveled abroad? And I wouldn't care if it was on a cruise to an island location, or if you were someone who lived overseas with parents. But what we all know is that nothing makes us more acutely aware of what it is to be you, to be from the culture that you're from, than going somewhere that is very, very different. So if we're looking at this comic right here, and you guys will do a lot of kind of comic analysis, everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. Nothing covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. For most American women, we see it from the perspective of the woman in the bathing suit. That to be told to be fully covered comes from this male-dominated culture. But if we attempt to see it from another culture's perspective, they may see that maybe the European and American standards of beauty, where women essentially go to the beach in their underwear, is revealing and exploitive. It really depends on where you come from. Now, this isn't to say that one is right and one is wrong. It's to say that other cultures that are different from ours build different ideas and perceptions of how the world operates. And in their eyes, they are correct, just like in our eyes, we are correct. Let's start looking at you. How will your social background help you decide what you're going to do after you graduate? Are you going to go into the workforce? Are you going to go to college? Are you going to go to a vo-tech school? Your background shapes the way that you set up your expectations. Here at Kettle Run, more often the question is, what college are you going to go to? Not, will you go to college? Will you choose another path? If we take this and we extend it to a global community, 5 out of 100 people worldwide go to college, so that's a 5%. So just living in the United States, living in Fauquier County, and living specifically in the area that would send you to Kettle Run increases the likelihood that you would go to college. The cost of college is skyrocketing, and a lot of people can't afford it. So if you don't know what you want to do with your life, you have no idea what your major is, have you considered alternatives? Vocational school, becoming a tradesman. We don't do a gap year and other countries do. So when we start looking at that, the cost of that education, for some people, that might be the reason that they don't go to college. And for some people, it might not be a barrier to their decision. And here in the United States, we feel like it's normal. College is second high school. We assume that students should just continue on, which is why often when you have a conversation with someone and they say something like they don't intend to go to college, it often is a stopping point in the conversation, and they're questioned as to why they made that decision. Where a student who says that they're willing to go to college, even if it would put them in huge financial debt, isn't really questioned about that decision. The first person that we will talk about is not the father of sociology. He's massively influential, and later when we talk about functionalism, you're going to hear his name again. This is Emile Durkheim. Emile Durkheim is brought up at this point because we're going to talk about how our personal choice exists in a social context. In other words, the society around us encourages how we make choices in our life. Again, this very large group dynamic. So Durkheim did research back in the late 1800s, and he was able to show that people were more likely to commit suicide when they felt that they were socially isolated, when they lacked social integration. That doesn't mean that they were all by themselves living in the woods. It meant that they felt that while in a crowd of people, they didn't connect to anybody. The amazing thing about Durkheim's research is that over 100 years later, this is still true, that there's something about social connection and social interaction that's important to humans, and that people who felt like they weren't integrated into a society were more likely to take their own lives. This was researched. This was studied. This was not just his idea or that he could find 1 or 2 examples that held true. Social integration, again, is just those ties that we have to the people in our lives, whether it's through work, friendships, family. People who feel like they're tied into the greater group have lower suicide rates. People who feel like they go it alone, whether it's through work or they feel like they don't have anyone that cares about them or anyone they connect with, those rates increase. We'll come back to this research by Durkheim later and talk about how things like social media platforms kind of confuse this idea of being integrated. The greater people's social marginality, the better able they are to use a sociological perspective. So, what is social marginality? I'll often tell students that the best way to remember this term is look at the margins of your page. They're always to the outside. Someone who has social marginality is an outsider to the main group. Does not mean that the main group can't understand or attempt to understand the issues that are being discussed. It's just that the people to the outside are often the ones that feel more acutely what's going on. So as a female, it's easier for me to talk about this when we talk about gender issues. It's easier for me to possibly see why someone would be offended or upset at the use of wording or different policies because it's more likely that I may have experienced it. However, as we start looking into that issue, we're going to find out that it's a lot more developed than just he said, she said, or men versus women. And that's true for pretty much every conversation that we'll have in this class. Conformity is another important concept in sociology. As much as you might be a unique individual, you're very similar to the groups in which you belong. And you belong to those groups because you value them and you share an identity with them. In our society, conformity is often necessary for the group to work harmoniously, but also we've all been taught a very similar way of life. Imagine going to the grocery store where no one conforms to getting into lines or paying before they leave the store. Some of this is obedience, but it is all conformity. We know a certain way to behave, and so we act as such. We often look to others in unfamiliar situations to help cue us into how we should behave. We're going to attempt to approach concepts in this course with a global perspective. This is going to be really important for 4 reasons. Where we live makes a great difference in shaping our lives. You already know that if you live in an urban area versus a rural area, you're going to have different ways of getting places, different access to supplies, and that changes the way that you see the world. If you live in a different country with different values and different opportunities, that's going to shape the way that you see your world. It's really important that we try to understand things from the perspective of the people within their own kind of global thought process. Societies world over are more interconnected, and you can thank the internet for that. There's increased trade, increased ideas. So much diffusion has occurred between other societies that the us versus them becomes less and less valid, and it's more important for us to try to understand. Normally in class we would start listing what we can see, but we're just going to go to the next slide so you can see a couple of examples. So McDonald's is everywhere. Coca-Cola is everywhere. We take in a lot of the kind of fashion, food, pop icons, and Pokemon from all over the world. A lot of what we enjoy as Americans aren't really American creations. And we give out to the world a lot of things. Now, I don't know if McDonald's and Coca-Cola are the best examples, but we also give out into the world a lot of our culture as well. Many problems faced in the US are actually more serious other places. This headline I know is very eye-catching, but you're never going to see that here in the United States. We don't have starvation at the level where children are dying at 20,000 each day. So when we start looking at some problems, it's important to note that our problems are important to us and they're very serious to us, but there are some problems that are faced in other places that might actually be more serious. It's also a really good way to learn more about ourselves. We often, as Americans, have certain kind of mindsets about how we're going to solve problems and how we're going to address issues. To see how other cultures solve problems and address issues might help us understand better or different ways to change our society. It's not to say that being American is bad. We're fantastic in my opinion. But we learn more about ourselves when we start looking at a global perspective and see how the rest of the world operates as well. Sociological imagination is the link between events in your life and your society. And while we could go into what has more personal meaning for you, a new pair of Nikes versus a really old picture of a cell phone, truthfully, you can see the relationship between events in your personal life and the events in society just looking at the last summer that we've had. how limitations on your ability to go places, buy things, do things also relates back into the greater society. And if you spend even more than a couple of seconds online, you can get into so many different conspiracy theories that it's just crazy. But we see the relationship between our personal events and what's going on in society, and it helps us predict and imagine those connections. If we were going back to the cell phone versus the shoes, if you picked one, you could sit there and ask a couple of questions that help you imagine the importance to our society. Who would buy it? Who sells it? Why does it become valuable and important? Why would someone spend $300 on a pair of tennis shoes? Do people suffer when they don't have this object? You can come back to the 2020 school year and look at internet connections and technology. You start to see the importance of that cell phone, just that little tie-in now that we need it. Does anyone suffer because they don't have this object? Well, currently, yes. So we start seeing how important it is to try to make these ties and see how societies attach to the material, the non-material, really everything, and what that means. It helps us understand the effects of events on our daily lives, grasp the connection between history and biography, and it allows us to challenge conventional wisdoms, things that people used to assume were true, by looking at whether or not it really does hold today in our society. The sociological perspective is useful in many ways. One, it helps guide many of our laws and policies. In our face-to-face, we'll talk about the Clark experiment, and this will help you understand how important research is to laws and policies. It's important to personal growth and expanded awareness. What is your truth might be contradicted by the research that we find out, and we find out about other people's truth. And it's an excellent preparation for the world at work, literally the workforce. Henry Ford was one of the first to really put sociology into play in his labor. Last bit that we're going to talk about is the historical origins of sociology. We're going to get into what we call the big three, but we're going to start with the father of sociology. Sociology is a relatively new science, and it begins in the 1800s. Every time there is a major change, you are going to see changes in society, whether that's the Industrial Revolution, westward expansion, voting rights for women. Auguste Comte is considered the father of sociology, and the biggest thing that you need to know from Comte is that he wanted to look at society as it actually operates, not how we want it to be or hope it to be, but how it is. And he used the term positivism. Positivism is the scientific observation and study of a society. His explanation, we are positive only if we can show how it was scientifically studied. So positivism is the technique or the idea of the scientific observation of sociology. Comte also looked at social statics versus social dynamics. Some things in society are relatively stable and don't have huge change. So you can go back 1,000, 2,000 years and still see elements of family, religion, language, and even division of labor. However, some things are dynamic and they change. And these are usually when we're talking about big movements, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. Society showed change. One of the interesting things is that even during these change, society still kind of reverts back to a certain amount of stability. We're going to talk about the big three theorists. Throughout this course, we're going to come back to these three theorists and their perspectives that they generate. The first one we'll talk about is Karl Marx, and you guys should have some familiarity with Marx from world history. Most of you know that Marx was the one that created the idea of socialism. Marx's entire idea is about materialism and the production of material goods shared throughout all aspects of a society. He looked at two major social classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie would be the people who owned, or the capitalists, the people who had control or means for producing wealth. So if you've ever heard someone called bougie, that might help you remember bourgeoisie. It's exactly where it comes from, having wealth. And the proletariat, they're the working class. They labor just enough to stay alive because those who have the capital don't want to give it up. He also talked about class conflict. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat would always be in conflict. And eventually, he thought that capitalism would fail. He even made a statement that America was going to be the failed experiment, that our capitalistic society would crumble upon itself and it would never flourish. Unfortunately, that was really more the truth of communist Europe with the fall of the Soviet Union and related societies. He also talked about class conflict, and he said that eventually there would be this conflict, that the proletariat would become aware that their lives were unfair and they would fight to overthrow the bourgeoisie. He felt that a very clear example of this was the French Revolution. He felt that the capitalist or the bourgeoisie would be scrambling for all of the power and all of the capital, and that by being so self-interested, they wouldn't be able to unify and a revolution would easily take hold. Marx argued that the reason that modern societies don't necessarily have this conflict is because people are trapped in a state of false consciousness, that they blame shortcomings on individuals rather than a society. Marx would say that societies would tell the individuals that it was their laziness or their inability to want to work that would cause them to be in a state of poverty, where he argued society itself is what was causing it. The next person we'll talk about is Emile Durkheim. And we talked about Durkheim a little bit earlier, but Durkheim operated in France, and he said that society had to function, and that it functioned due to this broad consensus amongst its members, just a big, large agreement. He said that there are certain things that were considered social facts, that they were true about societies even if it wasn't experienced by every individual. So, back to his research about suicide, it was a social fact that these factors caused people to feel disconnected from society and that they would then potentially commit suicide. That while it may not be true for every individual, it was rooted in the society, not the individuals themselves. Durkheim looked at two different types of societies. He looked at those that were pre-industrial and those that were post-industrial. He said pre-industrial societies had what he called mechanical solidarity, that all the jobs worked together, and for society to work like a kind of well-oiled machine, those bonds needed to be strong. Post-industrial societies, however, he said were more like organic. They were bonded because each job had its own specialization, and that it didn't necessarily depend on other jobs. So for mechanical solidarity, try to think about raising a barn. You might not be a carpenter, but in a pre-industrial society, that society would have functioned because the teachers, the doctors, whoever would have come to that barn raising to help everybody. If we look at post-industrial societies, and the way that I help people remember organic solidarity is just think about the organs in your body. Your heart can't take over the responsibility for your liver, and your liver can't take over the responsibility for your lungs. We're one entire functional organism because those organs work independently and take on a very important job. His problem with post-industrial societies that relied on organic solidarity is that with this specialization, there's a decline in trust between members of a society. So while you may go to your general doctor for a cold, you might not necessarily trust that doctor, even though they're a medical doctor with maybe a torn ACL. You may feel that you can only go to your orthopedist. And so you start to see this shift in decline and more of a reliance on specializations. Durkheim also warned that post-industrial societies need to be aware of anomie, which is when individuals receive little moral guidance. As we move into more and more technology, if any of you guys have watched Black Mirror, that's a really good example of anomie, that we're not necessarily sure what the social or the moral norms are, and maybe they're not even present as we introduce kind of new technology and things that keep us moving forward. And so he felt that lack of norms may lead to deviant behavior. The last person that we need to talk about is Max Weber. And Weber is going to be German, so the W sounds like a V. He looks at society and he says that societies are rational. And in fact, he thought that the most rational society was a capitalist society. So in direct opposition to Karl Marx. He said sociologists have to look at not these big pictures like Marx and Durkheim were talking about, but they need to look at the minutia, the tiny things, values, beliefs, attitudes. He said that you had to be able to mentally walk in another's shoes. As I just mentioned, he looked at society as being rational, and he considered capitalism to be the most rational. Whatever you create, if it's desired by that society, should earn the most money. But a lot like Durkheim, he feared that rationalization would lend us to dehumanizing or alienating people, and he became very pessimistic about a society's ability to escape this dehumanizing or alienating trend. All right, guys, that's it for your first lecture. Please make sure that you check Blackboard for any other associated work.